of defeats on the British in Afghanistan, and so they were never able to hold that. And so their empire, of course, was really only a maritime empire, not a land empire. And the largest part of their empire, geographically, was North America, and they lost that. And I suppose that's really the very beginning of the decline of the British Empire, was when they lost North America, so 1812. So world domination. Mackinder thought that, and you can just read this. I don't really want to read the same thing out to you, but look, the idea here is that central part of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, is a heartland, and it's got the richest resources, especially agricultural resources in the world. The soil in the Ukraine is black soil, and it's about 10 meters deep, which is just phenomenal. So you can grow anything there, really. And it also has, of course, huge quantities of minerals and energy, gas and oil and so forth. Any kind of mineral you can think of. So that is, an extraordinarily rich area, and it's not highly populated. So, it's still vast parts of that Central Asia still have very small populations. So Mongolia, for example, is a vast country, only has 3 million people. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all of the stans, except for Pakistan, which has a very large population, it's not really very well populated. So let's just go to the next one, and this is Heartland. So there you are, the center of the great Eurasian continent. That's the heartland. And then the blue area is what you might call the rimland, and we'll just talk about that in a moment. But the heartland, what's special about it? Well, it starts in Eastern Europe and it goes all the way to China. Mackinder called it the pivot area. In other words, everything's going to pivot around that, and then everybody's going to try and control it if they can. Now, that's the idea. Of course, it's a bit strange because Russia, of course, controlled a large part of that already, and we know that at the time Mackinder was writing his essay in 1904, Russia was about to lose a naval battle with the rising Japanese empire, and they were they had been in constant conflict with China, Qing dynasty China, and they'd been in conflict with the British as well, and not just in the center of Asia, but also elsewhere, in the Balkans, with the Ottoman Empire, with the Europeans, constant European wars. So, and then there's the world island, which is everything around that. So Africa, South America, Oceania, parts of Southeast Asia, North America. That's what's called the rest of the world. But the island, the world island, is the heartland, Eurasia. So Europe, Asia proper, China, Siberia, Southeast Asia, India, Saudi Arabia. This is the heartland right now, today. That's from LiveMap, and that is the front between the Ukraine and the Russians at this very moment. And you can see that that's a struggle over the heartland. Now, the heartland's basically divided. There's a sort of three people that really sort of have fed this theory. The first one was Mahan, it's an American sailor and cartographer, who said that sea power. Now, he came out of the same thing. He came out when the British Empire was so powerful, and he'd studied the Spanish and the Portuguese, and he thought that this maritime power was the most important thing. So everything in the world could be controlled if you controlled the seas, and to control the seas, you needed islands. And the islands give you a sort of an offshore periphery control over a mainland area. So Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, Australia is a big island, Mauritius, the Falklands. They start to think, oh, yes, people are fighting over all these islands. I wonder why. Well, that's why. Because they tend to control choke points. They control areas where there's very large naval activity, so merchant navy or military navy. And so that's the heartland there, the rimland, as you can see, and then there's the maritime section, the darker section around the maritime periphery. So heartland we've explained, and rimland just means you can access towards the heartland from the maritime. So that comes from the Second World War. Spikeman was a cartographer, geographer who worked for the American government, and he came up, he just sort of advanced the heartland theory by saying, well, look, we can just consider it a rimland, and we can use our naval forces to penetrate into the heartland. So that's what's called the rimland. And we'll find out and discover later that that's what, when we're talking about Vietnam and Korea, Iraq and all those things, that's really kind of rimland activity. So here's the naval part, sea power theory, and you can see straight away where the biggest blue line is, and that's directly from Europe, across the top of it, through the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Africa, and then right across all the way to Singapore. And of course, that would continue now across to the Pacific, and that gives importance to the Indo-Pacific, for example. So that's naval power. So here's rimland. It looks like this. This is the idea. Red pushing in. You can see the arrows here where they're pushing. And so pushing where? Pushing in Korea, pushing in Taiwan, pushing in Southeast Asia, pushing in the peripheries, Myanmar, for example, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the south of Europe, the north of Africa. So that's rimland and pushing in towards the heartland, the great Eurasian continent. So here's the Iron Curtain. So this is one end, right, of rimland. If you just think, here's rimland, and here's Europe over on the left-hand side, and you see that big black line there. And then we'll just have a quick look at the Iron Curtain, just to bring us into the present. So this is, the antagonism between the Soviet Union and the West. Now, it's got to be remembered that this had started earlier. It wasn't just post-World War II and then suddenly there's an Iron Curtain. It was Churchill who said there's an Iron Curtain, and the imagining of a barrier or a wall was not a Russian idea. They didn't think that this should occur at all. They were against this idea. This was a Western idea. This was Churchill's idea and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Truman's idea. And Truman has a lot to do with a lot of the geopolitical mess that we're in now. There was no real wall at all. But this is sort of an imagining, right? And then you can see that that's the rimland. You see that the idea there. So up that line now is all the way up to the heartland. So that's the idea of heartland theory. All right. So then the Marshall Plan. Let's throw some money at it. Let's reindustrialize Germany, specifically Germany and France, but mostly Germany. And the reason we need to do that, the Americans need to do that, and Marshall wanted to do that, was because they needed some industrial power, Germany, to resist Soviet power. So that's why it was reindustrialized. It wasn't, we're just going to make everybody rich and they can all have a Mercedes. It was, in terms of the heartland theory, it was in relation to making sure that the conquered Germany, because remember, there are still American armed forces in Germany, and Germany is still under treaty obligations from the end of the World War to the United States, and to make that a military and economic bloc to stop or to counter Russian power. And I won't say expansion, because at that time it wasn't really expanding. One of the misconceptions about the war in Europe is that the Americans won the war in Europe, and of course this is only partly true. Most of the lives were Russian lives. They lost almost 30 million people because of the Germans, and their industrial base suffered greatly, and they were in a terrible mess. And of course, they wanted to be part of the Marshall Plan, in fact. But the Americans said, no, we're not going to let you do that. We're not going to pay for you to reindustrialize because you control the heartland. So they didn't. And then now you can just see in this map here that NATO enlargement from 1949 all the way up to last year. So it just keeps growing towards the heartland. Now, just, whatever you already know about this and what you think about this, just try and put on the glasses that say heartland. So you're looking at it in terms of, okay, there's a heartland and you want to try and control it. So NATO is creeping towards the heartland, through the rimland into the heartland. And you can see here that if you can see my mouse, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that's the Ukraine right there. That's a missing piece that covers the top of the Black Sea, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's the bamboo curtain. Well, hang on, what? The bamboo, what? Yes, the bamboo curtain. So in the other side of the heartland, on the rimland, the Americans are doing the same thing. Now, we know that they reindustrialized Japan, and then they fought the war in Korea because what had happened, the Chinese had, Mao Zedong had won the Civil War, pushed the nationalists out to Taiwan, and so the Americans were very freaked out. So they said, we have to reindustrialize Japan. They weren't going to do that, but they decided after the 1949 that they needed to do that. And they partitioned Korea with the Russians. The Russians left, but the Americans stayed, and then they installed a puppet government in what they called South Korea. And of course, there was no South Korea. And you always hear people saying, oh, North Korea invaded South Korea, but actually it didn't, because there was no North or South Korea. There was only Korea. And the Americans had partitioned Korea, and then they had installed a puppet government and created South Korea. So it's a new creation. And so that narrative about, North invading South is kind of strange. It was actually a civil war, to reunify the Korean Peninsula. And they almost succeeded, except for, MacArthur arrived late in the game and pushed them back, and then the Chinese came in and pushed them back again, and so it remains partitioned. And I can tell you, all my conversations with Koreans, they'd like it to not be like that. They'd like it to be reunified. So, don't get too excited about North Korea, because most Koreans really want to still be unified. That's their number one objective. And South Korea was reindustrialized during the Vietnam War. And then, of course, all the little tigers, Singapore and Taiwan, Thailand, all U.S. allies, and they were reindustrialized through, and this was the American Defense Department spending to reindustrialize. This wasn't private capital. This was U.S. government capital that was spent in Europe and in Asia to reindustrialize these countries. And so whenever you hear the narrative about how they're successful democracies and they got wealthy because they're democracies, that's not really true. What happened was they were funded to be reindustrialized, and then they had access to the U.S. market for their exports. And that's what enabled them to become rich and wealthy again. So, it's not just because they're smarter or something. There was a lot of help to make that happen. And of course, the situation in Taiwan is a development from the Japanese occupation of Taiwan. So once the Americans had taken over, they won the war, so to speak, they dropped the bombs, then they set the terms. And India, at that time, just said, well, we're not going to be part of that. That's imperialism. We're not going to sign anything that says Taiwan has no status. And so they didn't go. But so it was only the allies who signed it. In other words, the Americans, the Australians, the British, the French, the Dutch, 6 countries who signed that deal called the San Francisco Treaty, which created the ambiguity of Taiwan's status. But Taiwan's status actually was had already been agreed that it was going to be given back to Beijing. But as soon as there was a communist revolution and a civil war, the Americans changed their minds very quickly and said, well, no, we can't do that. So let's have a look. So now we're talking about 2 fronts. And this is an article I wrote in the China Daily about a week ago. I think it's a week or 2 weeks ago, and it outlines the American strategy, which is basically a 2-front, 3-ocean strategy. So the first front is in Europe into the heartland, and the second front is in Asia on rimland, not really in the heartland, but on the rim. And then 3 oceans. So the Atlantic Ocean the Atlantic Alliance, that's NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Indo-Pacific, which is the new concept. Because remember, it's a concept. It's not a reality. It's just a concept. It's a way to look at it. And it's very much a military and economic way to look at it. So that's basically the two sides of the heartland, both backed, supported, funded by the Americans and their allies. Now, let's just slip forward to the War on Terror in 2001. Because we talked about Vietnam and Korea, and, Iraq and so forth. So 2001, the Americans are moving into where? So they say that it's about Iran, because remember, Iran is the belly, the soft belly of the Great Heartland. And one could argue that Pakistan is part of that too. But Iran is really the soft belly. And at that time, the Soviet Union, soft belly, and then later Russia's soft belly. And also, on the periphery of China. So, there was enormous activity here, enormous activity by the Americans. And they failed, of course. They still have some small occupying armies in Syria and in Iraq and some other countries there, and they have a huge base in Bahrain, but it's all basically at the periphery. It's not in the heartland. And then, of course, you remember that Afghanistan is part of this, right? Central Asia. So now at the same time, 2001, interestingly, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Pakistan is a member, so is India, so is Russia, China, and all the stands. And there's a lot of other countries who would like to join, including Turkey. Iran has actually joined, so this map is just slightly out of date. So that is the heartland, isn't it? Right there. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization basically is an organization that is set up to stabilize the heartland. And there it is. You can see it on the map. But it's not an actual military alliance. It's not like NATO. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization was basically really set up to negotiate all the frontiers and borders between the countries, between Russia and China and Central Asia, and to stabilize that area in the post-Soviet collapse. And that's what it did. It did it very well. And now, what it's been doing for the last 15 years it's being used to organize all the cross-border transport networks, pipelines, electricity, railways, all of that. All of the cross-border transactional stuff, including education and payments and all things like that, are done through the security organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it was a really big win when they got both Pakistan and India into that organization. And that means that Pakistan and India have a forum in which they can work with other countries' neighbors. And that's very useful for everybody. All right, now let's just have a quick look at Russia again. There's the heartland, a lot of the heartland anyway, most of it. And what you see on the blue dots are the ports. These are what Russia has as seaports. Now, the ones with red dots are the ones where there's some kind of warm water ports. And this is where, and we're going to have a look at these ports and why it's important to Russia, because Russia historically has always sought to get and maintain warm water ports. So the Black Sea warm water port was Odessa or Crimea, Sevastopol in the Crimea. And the Baltic Sea, St. Petersburg. And then the third one was in the Mediterranean, and that's in Syria, called Tartus. So Syria in the Mediterranean, Crimea in the Black Sea dominates the Black Sea, and St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad on the Baltic. And we'll just talk about that a little bit later. So very important to realize that these warm water ports, Russian access to warm water, so that means 12 months of the year navigation, Navy, merchant, whatever. Very important. These are US military bases. US, UK, Russia, France, and China. Russia's yellow. We all know there's about 800 US military bases, but if you include the NATO bases in France and the UK and what's more than that, much more. China has one black dot there, or very dark blue, just one, in Djibouti, and that's the entrance to the Suez Canal, the Red Sea. and can just mention to you that the entrance to the Red Sea, of course, one side is Somalia, which has been at constant war. Somalia on one side of the Red Sea, and on the other side is the Yemen. Now, there's no confusion here. The reason that those two countries are constantly in conflict is because they control the mouth to the Red Sea. And remember that big fat blue line for the maritime? It goes right past both of those countries, and that's why it's so important. And that's why there's always fighting going on there. Now, NATO membership, we just talked about that. It's expanding. And so there you can see that's kind of, we're back to the Iron Curtain, 70 years later, we're back where we started sort of thing. And so that is now expanding. Theoretically, it's expanding because the Russians have a special military operation in the Ukraine, but the Americans have been pushing for that to be expanded the entire time. And one needs to remember that every time the EU, the European Union, expanded, the Americans only agreed on the condition that NATO would expand too. So the Europeans have, we've looked at that and we said, the EU is getting bigger and richer and more powerful, but it was only done on the condition that countries would also join NATO. So a military defense network. But whether it's, can you say a military defense network when it keeps growing towards the heartland? Is that really defense or is that offense? You need to think about that. All right, NATO membership. So now 2008, we're getting very close to the Ukraine now. 2008, NATO decided there'd been a small war with Russia and Georgia. So I don't know if any of you know about Kautilya. He's a very famous sort of ancient Indian philosopher, advisor, strategist. And he said you always need to have buffer states. Between great powers, you must always have buffer states. And so I think you can see that in around Russia. And there's lots of these little states, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Georgia, and they break where powers meet. So where Turkey, Russia, and Iran meet, and there's three little countries between them, you see, sort of like a little jigsaw puzzle. And that's basically, they exist to create a buffer zone, a demarcation zone. And so basically that's what you might think the Russians are actually trying to achieve in the Ukraine right now. Anyway, so 2008, Bush, war on terror, GFC, global financial crisis. We're having a disaster. Inflation is crazy, right? And the Americans have exported this crisis, this financial crisis, because they're funding the war on terror. It's costing them total $7 trillion total. So their economy is suffering. And so then, their banking collapsed, subprime mortgage collapsed. But so while that was happening and everybody's suffering, in the rich countries are not so rich anymore, and poor countries have very high inflation and can't pay their debts, they go to Romania and they say, we're going to get Ukraine into NATO because the Russians are looking weak. So let's do it now. And there you have a picture of Stoltenberg with Zelensky, telling him what to do. Now, Stoltenberg is an interesting character. He was Prime Minister of Norway, and he began his role as a NATO Secretary General the year that the US backed the coup in Ukraine, 2014. So he has overseen the entire plan of NATO expansion into the Ukraine. He has been in control of all of that, and he's announced that he's I think he was pushed, but he may not have been pushed, but he's resigning and he'll be gone this year, which I'm beginning to think is a sign of weakness. But anyway, because he's the mastermind of doing all of this, and he's been responsible for the NATO expansion into Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine. So we're just going to go slightly back towards the heartland here, Central Asia, and you can see all of these, pipelines, railways, and things like that going up to the Caspian Sea, which is, this is Iran over here. I don't know, can you see my mouse? Central Asia pipelines, right? So this is the energy. There's Pakistan and Afghanistan, right? So now just imagine in that period of time, it was becoming very obvious that the Americans were not going to be able to win in Afghanistan. And the Americans had obviously, enormous forces with NATO forces. So NATO operating well outside of Europe, which is, very unusual. It's not supposed to be doing that, but it was extended. So they were given the right to do that. And then they later went to Libya and Syria and a few other places. So they're now operating outside, expeditionary, right? Not just defending, offensive, actively invading, like Iraq, right? And Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, of course, totally impoverished. But you can see that this area is, a transit area. So all the energy from Central Asia has got to transit. And where's it going to go to? There's only basically going two ways. It's going to China or it's going to Europe. So those are the two sort of, points of for energy, pipelines, roads, transport, all that stuff. And so this is the network right across the heartland here. We're in the heartland. And there's Ukraine right in the middle of it. And you can see, there's all those big pipelines going through there. It's very interesting. Now, it's also interesting to note that the largest source of revenue for the Ukrainian government prior to the coup in 2014 was the transit fees from oil and gas. That's how they made their money. So they were dependent, if you like, on Russia. Well, were they, or were they just making money? I mean, it's right in the middle. So that's the easiest place to put the pipelines. And if you want to pay me to do that, if the Europeans buy it and the Russians, give me 10%, well, why not? And so that's what they were doing, and that was very profitable. And the economy was looking okay at that time, actually. But you can see that there's all these other pipelines going around, and Nord Stream 2 at the top there, you can just see that was being built. Nord Stream 1, sorry. Nord Stream 2 hadn't started yet. But that's the network of pipelines, of energy, of money, right? Money and energy. Very important. We can't live without that. Now, let's go and have a closer look. Oh, yes. Here we are in the Ukraine, and look at all this energy coming from Russia and going to Europe, right through the middle of the Ukraine. So now, if you were a strategist and you wanted to get control of the heartland, you'd definitely have to stop them making money out of that, wouldn't you? So that's what happened in 2014, of course. The government was overthrown, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the importance there. You can see that there's all this energy, Central Asian energy, heartland energy, all going to Europe, right? Or China. And to Pakistan as well, and possibly India, and then into the Ukraine. So that's that's the transit state. So buffer and transit. All right, now this is what happened. Now you see there's just a red star right in the middle there. So by 2014, it was all over. Barack Obama was the president of the United States, and everybody knew it was all over. So they did the surge. They called it the surge, which is basically just, sending 150,000 more soldiers and try and pacify the country. But it didn't work. And so, as we know, they had to leave Afghanistan. So now, these are all the military bases. You see the military bases on the right-hand side in Asia, the U.S. military, right? And then the green bases on the other side. So and the heartland, Russia and China and Kazakhstan and everything, Iran and India and Pakistan. And right next to Pakistan in Afghanistan, that's where the dot is. That's the only basic U.S. base. There was some others, but they're all been closed now. So in what happened after the loss in Afghanistan, it meant that the U.S. no longer had any active military power in the heartland. Zero. So no access into the heartland. They've just been shut out of the heartland. They've lost Afghanistan, and now they're out of the heartland. And so Russia and China now are the two big powers in the heartland. India's unhappy. They want to have access. They want energy, trade. They want to be able to have Indian access, just like CPEC does for Pakistan. India wants to be able to access into Central Asia as well and get to Europe. So the Indians were a little bit unhappy about that. But they joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization along with Pakistan to try and figure out how they're going to do this, right? How you're all going to get connected to the energy and transit networks through the heartland. Anyway, so the Americans are out. And now they've got to withdraw. Where have they withdrawn to? Where are those green dots? And the answer is Ukraine. Ukraine is now the front line. So it used to be Afghanistan, but now Ukraine has become the front line. And of course, no American military anywhere between the Ukraine and the Western Pacific. None. So that means now all of the heartland is being shared by Central Asia, Pakistan, Iran, India, China, etc. First time in 300, 400 years. Oh, that's a big change. So this is the Chinese infrastructure deal. Now, what's different about this, of course, is there's no military. There might be some security for the trains and building and what, but there's no armies at all. And the idea, of course, is to who could pay for it? Nobody's got enough money to do it. The market's there. The Europeans have got money. They need it. Okay, let's go west. Where the Americans are blocking us in the east. Japanese are not friendly. All right, let's just send everything west. Let's do that. And that's what they did. And we all know about that now. Right, so pipelines, trains, airports, logistics, you name it, right? And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has done all of the negotiations and the transactions and to figure out, where the border crossings are, how to do the customs and the trade and the payment schedules and all that sort of stuff, all been organized in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Not just bilaterally, but in that larger platform so that everybody's joined into it. So it's got something of a feel of ASEAN about it. Now, 2014, bam, we've got to overthrow the Ukrainian government. This is not good. So because remember, 2013 is Belt and Road. And the next year, and Afghanistan's, basically lost. Where are we going to get to? We've got to go to Ukraine. That's the last kind of access point to in the east for the heartland. So what happened? Democratically elected government was overthrown. Now, it was done in a way that, people talk, social media, Barack Obama, but you have to remember these revolutions happened everywhere. They called it, there was the color revolutions, and then following that was the Arab Spring. But basically they used social media to mobilize youth and disaffected and pumped in lots of money, and they were successful in Libya. Now was the richest country in Africa, now one of the poorest. They were successful in Egypt, but the Egyptians have kind of been through this so many times, the military just staged a coup and took over. That's the current regime in Egypt. And they were successful in Mali, in Sudan, south of Sudan, Somalia, fighting going on there, Yemen, fighting going on there. So all of these places went through this sort of color revolution, Arab Spring, but none of them are better off for it. None of them are richer now than they were before, right? None of them. They're much, much poorer than they were before. So anyway, the government in the Ukraine was overthrown by a US-backed coup. And there's lots of evidence for this. It's not me just saying, oh, that's what happened. There's lots and lots of evidence for this. And the lady who was in charge of it, Nuland, she is now still in the State Department and still talking about the Ukraine and how the US has to fight the very last Ukrainian. And it's all very good and well for her because she's very nice and comfortable in Washington. But of course, in the Ukraine, it's not so nice. So that's what happened. So the government was overthrown, and what's the first thing they did? Well, they got rid of all the gas, the pipeline deals. They wanted to redo the deal. So the Russians said, no, you can't do that. So there was a lot of friction over the oil and gas, and of course the Americans were like, yeah, stop it, just stop it. And of course the Ukraine economy just crashed. It didn't have those transit fees anymore. So very bad news for the Ukraine in 2014, basically, but very good news for NATO. So at the next year, 2015, Syria. Now Syria, the civil war had been going on in Syria since 2011. Of course, the Israelis have a real interest in that. They wanted to get parts of Syria, the Golan Heights, which they've annexed, right? And the Russians have their only Mediterranean seaport in Syria. And very quickly it became evident that the Americans wanted to close that and restrict the Russians. So then they would no longer have a port in the Mediterranean. So they'd be in the Black Sea and they'd be in the Baltic Sea, but they wouldn't have access to the Mediterranean. So what did the Russians do? They said, no. And they went in there in 2015 and they backed the government and it worked. And the Americans have never forgiven them for this. There's a lot of resentment because Syria has still got the same regime and it's been demonized enormously. And I'm pretty sure that it's done some terrible things. But in terms of the heartland and geopolitics, the Russians, the warm water port into the Mediterranean, very important. And Syria is one of those small transit buffer states. Interestingly, it's the only state that doesn't quite connect the Belt and Road yet. So Iraq and Syria, right? Iraq and Syria. Because the part of Syria that has oil and that bumps up to Iraq, which is still controlled by the Americans in a big way, American military. Well, the Syrian oil fields are still controlled by the American military. So there's no way to get a Belt and Road transit through there. But all the other connections are done, actually. So that's the only part of the Belt and Road that doesn't connect yet, which means that Africa is not quite directly connected. So we just need Iraq and Syria to be more stable, and possibly that connection will be completed. So it means that North Africa will have access to Central Asian energy and the goods from all over Asia. So back to the Ukraine. Now here's a map. So you've got a good idea here of the parts of the Ukraine that we're talking about: Luhansk and Donetsk, Odessa. Now the Crimea is the dominant part of the Black Sea. So in other words, if you control Crimea, and that's where the Soviet Navy was based, if you control Crimea, you control all of the naval, all of the maritime networks in the Black Sea. And those networks have to get to the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. So very, very important part of that. You can see that's where we're struggling here. So that's your heartland right there. Now, here's the Belt and Road. Let's have a look at the Belt and Road. That's the red part's China, of course, but all the yellow connections, that's all heartland, right? All heartland. And now it can't go through Ukraine, right? Now the Ukrainians and the Chinese are actually on good terms. Very good terms, and they continue to be on good terms. The Ukrainians, realize they're not completely stupid. I mean, they understand that if you want to make some money in the world today, you need to have a connection with China. So that's give you an idea of what the Belt and Road really looks like now, and why the Americans are so unhappy about it. Because Belt and Road is very different, because it's not armies, right? You're not moving armies around. You're moving goods, and railways and roads go both ways. it's not just one way; it's both ways. So, and it goes to third countries. It's not like the old Soviet era where everything just went to Russia. This is, it's both ways. So anybody along the line, what is an economic belt? Anybody along the economic belt is producing something, a commodity or a brand or a part or, some kind of component or something, both ways. You're not just sending it to China. You can send it to somewhere else. That's the important part about it, really. All right. So let's go back and have another look at the Ukraine. And we realize here that the Black Sea, Crimea controls the Black Sea, but if NATO controls Ukraine, there's no way to connect through. You see, NATO's controlling that, and then they've got access to the Baltic Sea. Now, you see the Baltic Sea in the north. Now, remember, Russia's only got 3 warm water ports, right? The Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and Vladivostok in the east. So blocking this NATO block here, basically, if the Ukraine is part of NATO, it would control all of the Black Sea, and it would also control all of the Baltic, which means that Russia would not have access to those 2 seas. And if Russia doesn't have access to those 2 seas, how's it going to trade? How's it going to be rich? How's it going to survive? It just spent 500 years making sure it could do that, and NATO is going to undo that. So that's the plan, you see. It's a well-established plan to block Russia in the heartland and not allow it to trade outside via the sea, right? Maritime rimland pushing in towards the heartland, right? And this is what the Russians are worried about. Is that what NATO's doing? It's blocking them from the Baltic to the Black Sea, access into the Mediterranean, Syria, access from the Black Sea in the Ukraine, access to the Baltic through Poland and Estonia and all those little Lithuania, etc. So here it is. There's this little tiny piece of Russia here called Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. And the Germans complain that it's got nuclear weapons, and, well, maybe it does, I don't know. But it protects the mouth of the Baltic Sea. So, in other words, it guarantees that, and that's the reason that the Russians were able to keep it, it guarantees that they can control the mouth of the Baltic as well as up to St. Petersburg, so that they've got their maritime traffic all the way through the Baltic Sea, and that remains open. So, freedom of navigation, right? Freedom of navigation for the Russians. Nobody ever speaks about that. It's always freedom of navigation for the 7th Fleet or something. But there's freedom of navigation for Russians too, and for Pakistan, and for Cambodia, and for anybody really. So that's why the Russians are holding on to that. But as you can see here, when Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia went into NATO, suddenly that little part of Russia was not connected to Belarus anymore, to Russia anymore. So that's what's called the Suwalki Gap. And of course, Russia is very, very worried that it can't access Kaliningrad from the land. And so Belarus, of course, is very important in this, maintaining the relationship with Belarus, which is what the Russians are doing. Now we'll just keep going. That's Nord Stream there. Nord Stream, there it is, right along the Baltic, right? Kaliningrad, Russia, St. Petersburg, Russia, all the way through Nord Stream down to Germany. So we all know that somebody sabotaged the Nord Stream. And now that's very, very dangerous, because everybody in the world is now worried that somebody, a power, could just blow up your stuff. Pipelines, digital, fiber optic cables, electricity transmission lines, all gas pipelines, ports. This is very, very scary for the whole world. You've got to be thinking, and every country in the global south especially is having that thought. They're having, well, hang on a second. People are now willing to blow up international infrastructure. and not claim credit for it. They're just doing it and then saying they didn't do it, basically. Right? Now, I'm not saying that the Americans did it because it's not been 100% proven, but I think it's very obvious that that's where if you were Sherlock Holmes, you'd be looking at the United States. All right, now, so there's that, what they call the Lublin Triangle. That's the same area, right? So that's a real stress point for Russia. And that's why if Ukraine was to go into NATO, Russia would be locked, and then it would lose Kaliningrad, and then it would lose access to the Baltic. So, for the Russians, this is existential. Real meaning of existential, not pretend existential, real existential. It would kill their trade. It would really, really be damaging to their economy. All right, now here in the Black Sea, same thing. You can see Black Sea gives you access down to the Mediterranean. Black Sea out to the Mediterranean. So that's also very important, and you can see that the Russians, no matter what, they're not going to allow the Black Sea to be encircled by NATO countries, which it almost is now. So if the Ukraine was to get it, Georgia, Turkey, Russia would basically, the Black Sea would be encircled, and they would not have access to that either. There's a convention, basically a convention, Montreux Convention. Everybody can get access through Turkey, easy. Only the Turks can break that, but they won't, and they haven't, because they need the trade too. So that's the same for Suez and so forth. Panama. There's these kind of conventions. Everybody's got to have access. All right. So now let's just look at the two strategies here start to come together. US and EU Indo-Pacific. So you can see in the top picture, there's the EU is the green square. Not a square, it's a whatever it is, parallelogram of some sort, and a rhombus, just for you people, for you nerds, I think it's a rhombus. And there's another rhombus over here in the blue one, which is the American. So that's the blue is the US Indo-Pacific sort of control area, and the green is where the Europeans are supposed to do their stuff. And you can see that the red is the Belt and Road. Right, through the heartland. And what are the Europeans and the Americans doing? They're pushing on the rimland towards the heartland, trying to stop maritime, right? Maritime trade everywhere. That's why we looked at those Russian ports, right? The heartland, access to the sea for the heartland, very important. All right, we're getting close now. All right, here's a balloon. Look, it's a balloon. Okay. And so for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, everybody's been looking at this damn balloon. Why? What's so interesting about this balloon? There's hundreds and hundreds of these balloons flying around. Everybody has them. I am pretty sure Pakistan's got a few of them too. And it's never been a problem. As long as I've been alive, I don't remember a balloon having such a big media exposure. And that the first thing, and I remember the first thing they said, we've got this Chinese spy balloon on CNN, and I turned it on, and I had a look at that, and I turned around to my colleague and I said, let's all look at the balloon instead of looking at the Ukraine. Let's not look at the Ukraine. Let's look at a balloon. So that's what everybody did. They all looked at the balloon. But really, of course, 2 weeks later, so last week, the intelligence official said, yeah, it's a weather balloon. Yeah. Well, I think anybody who was involved in international relations and international security, who really had their head on, knew that this is a distraction, a media distraction. We're all looking at the big, bright, white balloon and not looking at what's happening on the ground in the Ukraine and other things like a rail derailment in Ohio where poisonous gas was put into the air. It didn't even make it. And Seymour Hersh, the Nord Stream article was released that week. The same week as the balloon went up, the Nord Stream article came out about the Americans had organized and planned the destruction, sabotage of Nord Stream. And so everybody's looking at the balloon. And that still to this day, the New York Times, the Washington Post have not run a story about Nord Stream destruction. So that's independent media. So it's very hard to believe, really, isn't it? But there it is. And yes, as everybody jokes about this, it cost what was it, 2 million or something, 2 million to shoot it down, and it's only worth $50 or something. All right. So this is the situation on the ground. While everybody's looking at the balloon, what's really happening? Well, what's really happening is the United States is split in two directions, right? It's got two fronts on three oceans, and its economy is not in good shape. I mean, no matter what you hear, the US economy is in terrible shape. They've got enormous debts, high inflation, political polarization, social troubles. People get killed all the time. It's really not safe. Their infrastructure is crumbling, and it all looks very nice on Hollywood. Like, I watch TV and Netflix or something, and everything looks fantastic. Everybody's rich and they're really nicely dressed and everything. But if you actually walk around on the street, and I lived in America for 5 years, it's not like that. It's definitely not like that. So there's real problems for the Americans here to be able to maintain this. They don't have the financial resources. And that explains a lot as to why they've kept saying to everybody else, you have to stop using Russian energy because then you need American energy. You have to buy more weapons because they have to be American weapons and we'll make money doing that. And you have to pay more for defense so that we pay less. And so there's real reasons for that. But despite all of that, US military spending is increasing all the time. It's now almost $1 trillion a year, and they really just don't have the money. But here in Bakhmut, in the center of the Ukraine, at the front, I should say, not in the center, physically in the center, but at the center of the front, things are not going well. The US is not able to supply munitions. Each round of funding and weapons has been smaller than the last. In other words, it's diminishing. In other words, all of the supply that's coming from the US and the NATO countries is getting smaller, not bigger. Like the news story is getting bigger, like the balloon, but the actual dollar number and the actual amount of weapons is decreasing, not increasing, decreasing. And if you think you can win a war in Russia, very close to Russia with 80 tanks that are 40 years old, you're dreaming. Here they are getting surrounded in Bakhmut, and basically that means that the center of the Ukrainian defensive line is collapsing. It's very bad news for the Ukrainians in real terms. It's very bad news for the Americans, and I think you can see why everybody's saying, well, the Americans are becoming hysterical about balloons and about all sorts of things. They're really very strange behavior from the US diplomats and even Biden. Biden's speech in Poland where he just called everybody names. He said he was really rude. And what's going to happen when he has to sit down at the table and he's already called Putin a murderer? It's very, very difficult to sit opposite somebody when you've insulted them so much. So that's very difficult. But look, the situation on the ground in the Ukraine is not looking good for the Ukrainians. They are losing a lot of men, and those men are not well trained. They don't have enough weapons. They can't get them. They don't have enough money, and the Russians have very short supply lines. So it's easy for the Russians to get new supplies, and it's an artillery war at the moment, and the Russians are winning, and winning by a big margin. So very, very difficult, and the Americans are in real trouble here. So here they are, they're in trouble. They're in a train. Now, that train photo reminds me of, the North Korean leader going somewhere. When's the last time you saw an image of an American president having to take a train, not a plane? I mean, it's extraordinary. That is really, like North Korea or somewhere. Just very, very strange. And then the other photo of him, small desk and writing a check. He doesn't have any money. I mean, the Americans don't have any money, and they're still writing checks. Now, who's going to pay for it? So that's very, very problematic. All right, here's the Ukraine's GDP per capita, right? Per head, how much money per head? And look what it is now in 2023. Look where it was in 2014, 2013, 2014. 2013, highest ever. 2013, highest ever. Before the coup, highest ever per capita GDP in Ukraine. Highest ever. Poorest country in Europe. The poorest country in Europe. And in 2013, it had its highest ever GDP. Since then, not so good. It looks pretty good in 2021, but actually that's just all that foreign money being pumped in. It's not real business or anything like that. That's just, aid packages from the United States, basically. And weapons. I mean, enormous amounts of weapons and money, so it's not, doesn't really tell you, the economy in 2013 and the economy in 2021, they look almost the same per capita, but actually the money is very, very different. That money is being used to buttress the government for weapons, and the US is basically paying all of the salaries of all of the public servants in the Ukraine. I mean, it's basically a 52nd state right now at this moment. And then the actual GDP, have a look at it. 2013, very good. 2014, halved. Have a coup, what happens? GDP drops. Look at 2015, 2016. So it's slowly climbing back. But that's, the Europeans are trying to help. The Americans are pumping lots of money in there. But it's not going to work. And look where it is now. So, not good. All right. Now, in the Munich, a week ago, in Munich, Wang Yi said, peace. We're going to offer a peace agreement. Now, remember that it's the Chinese who are mediating all of the arrangements in the in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and with Afghanistan. It's China that's mediating that. And it's been China that's mediating in the South China Sea, trying to get the code of conduct. So they are now, in my personal opinion, they are now the most powerful mediating force on the planet. In other words, the Americans are so far to their position, and the Russians are so far to their position, that who is powerful enough to be able to mediate and moderate the discussions and the negotiations. And of course, who's taking that role? China. They've got one military base outside of China, and everybody says, the Americans say, they're building their defense and everything else. Well, yeah, but it's all in China. It's not all over the world, so it's very different. And the Americans are saying, no, they're terrible. They're going to give weapons to the Americans, to the Russians. So you can see this sort of dichotomy at Munich. Chinese saying, okay, we want to mediate the peace, and the Americans saying, absolutely not. And this tells you also about that big balloon, because while the Americans knew that the Chinese were going to propose peace, put forward a big peace proposal, the Americans knew that, and they're trying to sideline the Chinese. So by the balloon, pointing at the balloon, and now saying they're going to give weapons to the Russians, what they're trying to do is make China not be the mediator. But it can't be done, and I think China's got the upper hand here. They're going to put out their position paper in 2 days. And that is going to influence what happens. Now, here's Putin and Wang Yi after the Munich conference. They meet, very jovial, very happy, rock solid was the word. And what that means is, now you think about it, why really did Wang Yi go to Russia? And the answer is because they're going to put a peace proposal. So the Russians have got to sort of come up with something they'll accept. You're going to put forward a peace proposal. You've got to say, well, the Russians will accept this. And what are they going to accept? Well, they're going to accept a buffer zone between NATO and Russia, or Ukraine neutrality. And they're not going to accept losing the Black Sea. And they're not going to accept no access to the Baltic Sea. They're not going to accept that. That's impossible. What they are going to accept is that there's a buffer zone. And that's going to be those little states, Donetsk and Luhansk. And I think that the next really big summit, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, is the BRICS Plus summit. Now, the BRICS Plus, so that's in August. So between now and August, there's going to be this peace proposal put up, and it's going to go to all the BRICS countries. Pakistan's going to get a look at it. They've already looked at it, I imagine. And they're all going to, the global south basically is going to figure out what they will accept and what they'll sign up to. And that's the Chinese way. They're going to work through consensus building. They get everybody to sign up to what's agreeable, and then they're going to put it on the table at BRICS. And who's joining BRICS? Oh my goodness. Let me see. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Argentina. So you can see what's happening here. Think about Heartland again, and think about the world island and the rest. And you can see here that if you've got the Heartland organized, Russia, China, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, all working together, suddenly the BRICS Plus is more powerful than the G7. So this is basically, we are at a major turning point in world history this year. Power, for the first time in 400 years, almost 500 years, is switching from European and North American power to Asia. Now that's monumental. And that's really what's happening here. Now, there's other parts of this that need to be worked out, and it might take, it won't just all happen in one day. But when it does happen, it happens quickly, and all the bits need to be worked out. And one of the biggest and most important parts of this is de-dollarization. The Americans have weaponized the dollar. They've taken the foreign reserves of Russia. They've taken the foreign reserves of Venezuela, the foreign reserves of Libya, the foreign reserves of a lot of countries. They're sanctioning everybody. Now, 20 years ago, there was about 500 sanctions. Now there's something like 20 or 30,000 sanctions. The office for sanctions is so big you could, have a football game in it. I mean, it's just so huge. So this has, I think everybody in the global south has understood that weaponizing the dollar is very, very dangerous. Now, who wants that? Asian financial crisis in 97, everybody was becoming a bit more careful. Global financial crisis in 2008, while the Americans are having another war. Let's be even more careful. And now with the pandemic and a very aggressive America weaponizing their dollar, everybody doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. Everybody wants to do it another way. And that includes India, that includes BRICS, that includes Pakistan, China, everybody. They all want another way of doing it. But they don't want to just get rid of America. That's not the idea here. What is multipolarity? The Americans have to become one of the poles, right? An important pole, one of the poles, but stripped of the reserve currency role because they're not trustworthy. Nobody can trust them. They've proven that. So this is the first time that you're going to get the BRICS Plus and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members all together, plus other global south countries. They're going to look at this peace proposal at the BRICS, and they're going to come up with a solution, and then it's going to be tabled at the UN in September. So now the Ukraine war basically is going to run down. Just think about what happened in Vietnam and the Paris peace talks and so forth. Maybe they'll try and make it last. The Americans will pump more, NATO will pump more into it and everything, but everybody knows it's already over. And now it's all about peace. And China's put the peace proposal up into BRICS. They're putting it into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the rest of the global south. And that'll be the document that the UN General Assembly will vote on in September. Now that's what I think that's the timetable. That's what you need to be looking at, is what's going to happen between then and now. And just as a last summation, I just want to say to you as students, it's very important not to look at the balloon. Please try not to look at events, because what happens is if you just look at the explosion and you look at the event, right, the big explosion, then you don't look at all the things that caused the explosion. And what I've tried to explain to you today is a kind of a fairly shallow overview of what's really pushing the power equation in the Eurasia area and the world, the global south more specifically, BRICS and SCO. What's pushing that whole turning point in the world today, of which Pakistan is such an important part. For the first time in Pakistan's history, it's got access both ways, up and down to the sea and up to markets in Central Asia through China, etc., out into the sea and so forth and so on. And that's amazing, and I expect to see huge benefits from that going forward, and this is all part of that. And I'm pretty sure that Pakistan is going to be supporting the peace proposal. I can't guarantee it, but yes. So thank you very much for listening to me talk so much, and I hope there's enough time for us to have a good question and answer section right now.
Thank you, Professor D.P. James, and you present a wonderful presentation and wonderful speech, and you gave us a very new and different narrative other than the Western propaganda media gave us different narratives where every experts and scholars are singing the Western songs, but you presented a very different narrative. Okay, thank you so much for. Now, I am opening the floor for question answer. We have Professor Digby. Can we take questions through chat or through live question?
Well, live questions would be better, but but chat, I'm not sure how I do that.
Okay. Okay, students, you can raise.
Just tell me what the questions are.
Okay, student, you can raise your hand. I will allow you, and then you can ask your question. First, Mr. Faisal Sadiq, I think he wrote 2 questions in chat box.
In the chat. Okay, so how do I? Let me just check how to do that. The chat. There it is. Okay. It didn't take too long for me to find it. 3 people in the chat room, in the waiting room. Is that what? So in the waiting room, is that the thing? Okay. Here we go. All right. Muhammad, what? What is that temporary input? Do I have to download that or what?
Okay, I speak. One student asked a question: how do you see President Vladimir Putin's latest request table with respect to North-South trade route, as it will bridge the gap of heartland and rimland? This will be on the same lines like CPEC is doing, joining China to Indian Ocean. And another question is: Luzon is coming up in May, and no more Sikh Turkey with some transit fees coming up while crossing Marmara, and rail link working between Pakistan, Iran and Turkey. So maritime link is there as well. How you see Iran's role in that context? See, the student have 2 questions. One about international north-south corridor, transit corridor, and second in Lausanne treaty.
Yeah. Look, any active corridor for transit or transport of any kind is a good thing. I mean, that's basically what every country's economy needs. The more connection you have, the better it is. And this is true, just you think about your own personal networks. The more networks you have, the stronger your networks are, the busier you're going to be. So that's very true. I mean, and of course, Russia is now stimulated to bolster its internal economy, domestic economy, as fast as it can. So, of course, promoting any more connections is going to happen as fast as it can. And I think it'll get assistance from its friends to do that. I'm pretty sure that will happen. As for the pipeline, it's the pipeline through Marmara, the Turkish, as TAP, I think it is. That's a good alternative route, and I think that's important, and the Turks need it. I mean, Erdogan has been playing the regional mediator, not the global mediator. The global mediating role is China. The regional mediating role has been Turkey, Erdogan. Now, he's part of both camps, right? He's an observer in the SCO. He's in NATO. He can block Sweden and Finland if he wants to. And I think he's basically already doing that, sitting it out, waiting to see what's going to happen. He said Turks are going to remove their troops from Syria. That's good. Less pressure for the Russians. Turkey is a real player here. But remember that the EU has, yes, you can join NATO, but you can't join the EU. So, they don't want to allow the Turks en masse access into Schengen. There's a lot of racial, religious bias in that. I've been to Turkey 4 or 5 times, and I love Turkey, wonderful place, and the way the Turks have been treated by the Europeans is really dreadful. But so I think, Erdogan's been punished by the Americans on his economy, currency manipulation, reserves, and so forth. Look, if they can get transit and then get transit fees on energy, it's very profitable. Why not? Go ahead, do it. And then also get access into through Syria and so forth for energy, and that's also important. Water is going to be an important area of discussion for Turkey and Syria in the future as well.
Okay. Next question, Struan wrote about the SARC. SARC is not functional and almost has died. So Struan say do you think Pakistan should join BRICS?
Do I think Pakistan should join BRICS? Yeah, why not? I mean, at least as an observer, go in there as an observer. I think BRICS is, it's definitely now more powerful than the G7. So, yes, definitely, Pakistan should definitely seek a seat at the table. And look, it's consensus-driven, and Pakistan's working well in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's working well for it. So look, it's another leg, to support Pakistan's future. I think that's worthwhile. And Pakistan has got to have a very close look at what is going to happen in Afghanistan. As Afghanistan in the past was a very important trade crossroads, and so that if that trade crossroad can be rebuilt, there's a lot of money going to be made by Pakistan out of that. And I think the same is true in the West to Iran. Having a very good, close relationship with Iran is also very, very important. The Indian situation, of course, is going to be much more reliant on doing these large-scale forums, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and possibly also in BRICS. That's going to be good for the relationship with India.
Okay. Mr. Anis, please ask your question.
Hello, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
This is Anis Kamrani from student of IR. Sir, my question is that does the heartland theory and one belt, one road strategy of China are same or not? Because nowadays, same like China is applying to constructing many seaports around the South Asian countries for not only expand their business but also controlling the region.
No, it's not the same thing. I mean, remember that heartland theory was at a time when maritime power was, British maritime power. That was the view of the world. The maritime powers had taken over the world. Spain, Portugal, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands. They had taken over the world and colonized the world. And so he was just looking at the one area that they weren't able to do that. And because remember, the scramble for Africa had also happened, right? So he was just looking at that and just going, well, hey, we territorial power. It's obviously we're not able to get there, and so that could be possibly turn around and somebody would control that, like the Mongols. And I think really he must have been looking at the Mongols and thinking, yeah, if you really got hold of that. But look, no, China's vision is not based in heartland theory, not at all. China's vision is based in China theory. China is not in real terms part of the heartland, not specifically, because China has pushed its borders up to the mountain ranges at its periphery. In other words, Xinjiang has a mountain range, the Himalayas are a mountain range. There's a mountain range also in the north, up in near Siberia. These are the sort of natural frontiers, and there's mountains also in the south, near Vietnam and Laos and Myanmar and Thailand. So those are sort of the natural frontier borders of China, and it's been that way for, well, you know, thousands of years. So I don't believe it. It's true to say that somebody's beeping a lot here. It's not true to say that China has the same idea. It could be seen that way, and I think I showed one of the slides that kind of shows it like that. But actually, it's not, because look, it's true that China is going to have more influence as, you know, its economy gets larger and larger. And but what? So you know, what the Americans are doing here is they're saying China's economy is going to be so large, they're going to be so powerful that we have to stop them. So to stop them, we have to destroy their economy, and that's what they're doing to Russia, actually. So, and that's what they, you know, and that's what's happened to Venezuela and Libya, and you know, so you know, there's something very wrong about that conceptual idea that you're going to, because somebody's just naturally big and they've already been around for a few thousand years, and they're suddenly your peer competitor. You have to make sure that they don't get richer and they don't have advanced technologies and what. So no, I mean, I think that's very old thinking, and I think the Chinese vision is very clearly stated, and that is that it's consensus built. It's based on the ideas of harmony and mutuality, and I think that's true. And if you've spent any time, really any long length of time in China, you would know that it's that's something that's fundamental in their philosophical point of view, and it's also part of their Marxist point of view, in the sense that Marxism talks about the well-being, right? The state of being, and that is the most important thing in this. And if local populations are connected, and they get richer, they trade, well, then that's a good thing. And I think all of, you know, connecting Europe to right across Asia and into Africa, everybody's going to get rich. I mean, that's really what's going to happen here. Now, the hard part is making sure that people don't start fighting over who gets this and who gets that. It's got to be done by consensus. And so, you know, veto power doesn't exist in the SCO, and veto power doesn't exist in the BRICS, but it does exist in the United Nations, which was set up by the Americans. So, you know, I'd be if I was you, I'd be looking at veto power.
Okay, Said Mustafa, please.
Hello, sir. My question is about Afghanistan. As you see that the Americans are supporting the Taliban, and by giving them $40 million a month on the name of the humanitarian aid, and when you see that on the foreign ministries of the Iranians and the Tajiks and the Russians said that there are multiple terrorist camps are in the provinces of Badakhshan, Takhar and Kunduz. So what do you think that these relations will lead to a new alliance, that the National Resistance Front will be supported by these Indians, Iranis and the Russians to counter these terrorist camps and the Taliban, or they will be allied of the Taliban?
It's a very difficult question, really, because
I think it's not relevant to relevant.
But I would just like to make a comment about that, and it's a very kind of fundamental idea, and that is that as long as people are poor, destitute, hungry, uneducated, and not connected, then they're going to fight over very small things. And this is the situation that Afghanistan has been in, and that parts of Pakistan have been in, and other parts of the world. And you know, and I really hate to say this, but the Americans have promoted this and caused great suffering in a lot of places. And I just read today, 2.4 million Iraqis died during the Iraq invasion that was done, on false pretenses and all that. And I just, people start moralizing about the Russians, when the Americans start pointing their finger at the Russians. And they really have no moral grounding in here at all. Zero. Nobody can believe that after what they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think Afghanistan, and look, I've had some conversations with some of the ambassadors from the stands that border with Afghanistan, not the Pakistani ambassador, but the former Pakistani ambassador. Look, the role there is at the periphery is to keep trade open. Let as much trade go through as you can and let the Afghanis make some money. And as soon as they start to make some money and they feel secure, nobody wants to live in a terrorist camp when he's got children to feed and he's making some money and he's got a field of corn to harvest, et cetera, et cetera. People only do that when they don't have money and they don't have education, they don't have access. So that's the key, right? You've got to understand that that's the real key, right? That's the concentration on the material well-being of the people. It's got to be the most important thing, and then those people will not become violent. People only fight, besides crazy people. People only fight when they're hungry. Just got to remember that all the time.
Okay, Abdul Samad, please ask relevant questions, please, and don't ask you a relevant question. Abdul Samad, please.
Hello, sir. Sir, my question is regarding regional cooperation about heartland theory. Do Russia can get some relief against the Western plan of restricting Russia into the heartland only? What role can regional powers play to neutralize the Western effect, as it is regarded as the Asian century?
The Dutch Prime Minister just said that he thought it wasn't the Asian century, it was another American century. That's what he said. And I just was like, really? I don't know what he's like asleep or something. But he's obviously not been to China yet or Pakistan. The multilateral formats are the way to go here. I mean, there's the bilateral formats are really good for, you set up, FTAs, trade arrangements bilaterally, you have exchanges, you do all of that bilaterally, but the multilaterals are the most important. And those multilaterals exist, and I've just talked about those, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is all of the heartland, and importantly, Pakistan and India are both in there, and Iran also. So this is really important, and it's consensus. There's no veto. There's no, it's not like the Security Council, when one nuclear power can say no. No, it's not like that. Everybody has to agree, and ASEAN is done in the same way. So I think that's very, very important if you think about it. That on China's periphery, in Central Asia, and China's periphery in Southern Asia, where the Americans are pushing, that's where they're pushing. The two blocks are consensus-based organizations, which is democratic, right? Not veto organizations. So I think that's very, very important, and they need to be strengthened, and they need to be used more for cultural, agricultural, trade of all kinds, cross-border and all of that, accelerating de-dollarization, all of those sorts of things, stabilization in every way, harmonization of all of the things that can be harmonized, administrative plus physical. That needs to happen as fast as possible. The faster the better, really, as long as no mistakes, right? That's what needs to happen. Russia, Russia is, people don't understand the depth of feeling. But the Russians have suffered enormously. They suffered enormously at the hands of the Mongols. They suffered enormously at the hands of the Germans a couple of times. They've suffered enormously at the hand of the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Swedes. They've been invaded so many times, and they've suffered enormously. But particularly, with the Germans. I think people don't realize just how much they've sacrificed to be able to maintain Russia. And anybody who's running around thinking the Russians are going to get rid of Putin because they're not happy, they're out of their minds. The Russians are going to support him until the end. And at this point, I will tell you that I think Russia is going to get out of this special military operation what it seeks to, and that is a buffer zone, and to have the Ukraine kind of, shall we say, neutralized. So take a neutral line and not be part of NATO. I mean, I think this is really sort of a key step, and the population won't change. And we've seen that, all the big countries basically have supported that position. All of Africa, Latin America, most of Asia, all of Asia, plus China and India have supported that. And that's what's, that's the new reality. When every time I hear somebody in the American government saying, global leadership or something, and I think, well, hang on, they're leading less than 15% of the world's population, only half of the global economy, really only half these days, totally dependent on other parts of the world anyway. I think, no, who are they leading? They're not. I mean, it's this action that's going on is, I think, is probably the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Russia will come out of this stronger. Look, Russia's economy is growing faster than the UK economy. What else do you need to know? Russia has positive economic growth. The UK is shrinking by 2%. And that's going to continue.
Okay.
And because all of that, everything, Russia has everything that you could possibly want. And if the Japanese got smart, they'd be doing that too.
Okay, Nuzhat.
Hello, sir. My question is, it's been 1 year since the Russia-Ukraine crisis began, and the possibility of a truce was quite blurred. As you have highlighted in your lecture about few weeks, like it was some peace proposals by China. However, today, early morning, China came with the 12 points for the ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. So what's your opinion
Morning,
on the
I haven't seen it. I'm doing this.
Early morning, they have came with 12 points.
So what are the 12 points? Why don't you tell us what they are?
So they are like war can't do anything, like they have to cease fire, and there are many points.
Ceasefire. Number one, ceasefire.
Right.
Number two.
Number one is ceasefire. Like they have to stop all the things, and they should come with a peaceful resolution.
Okay. No, but look, all peace plans kind of start that way. There has to be a ceasefire. And then once there's a ceasefire, then you say, okay, there's a line of control. So everybody has to go behind the line of control. And of course, Pakistan knows all about this. Pakistan's been through this so many times, and they're very good at it. Which is really a good reason for the Pakistanis to be involved, is because they know how to do this. And other news today was, of course, that there's a new settlement between the Indians and the Chinese on the line of control, which is also very important. So you can see that. And there was another thing that happened was the Indonesians signed a deal with the Vietnamese over the South China Sea, over their economic zones. So you see that there's this kind of, I think, and I believe this to be true now, is that there is a global tendency to move away from this kind of militarization of everything, and to get to a situation where can have negotiated settlements for pretty well most of the troubles in the world today. Military solutions just don't work anymore because, hey, you're in Karachi and I'm in Cambodia and we're talking to each other, and everybody knows everything all the time. That is planetization. And this idea that you can put up a balloon and nobody will notice, that's over. So I think that as I laid out the plan for you, right? There's a proposition. Everybody's going to talk about it. Everybody will come back. The first really, look, it could happen faster than I imagine, but there's a natural kind of a timeline for a global thing. So the BRICS would be the first one in August. So, what is it now? It's February, March, April, May, June, July, 5 months. 5 months, getting an international peace deal together is, Pakistan knows very well how long it can take. So, 5 months would be a really good timeline. There'll be intense diplomatic activity. Intense. I mean, really, really intense. And the Americans are going to do everything they can to discredit everybody involved with this. They will do everything they can because they don't want it to happen. But what they're forgetting, of course, is that when Henry Kissinger was flying around trying to broker peace in the Middle East, and the Americans were in the position that the Chinese are in now, basically. So, look, that's a very good step forward. I'm very glad to hear from that, and I'll check it out as soon as we stop.
Okay. Afzal Sabah, please ask a question.
Adras Savicek Drubio, Mr. Speaker. I have a question. I'm starting from Baltic States. After the Baltic State, I'm going to start from Baltic State after the Ukraine issue getting more importance for the Russian as well. So, at what extent do you see the current visit of the United States President? How much that creates the relation between Russia and the United States? And the second part is that as you mentioned, the foreign issue after the withdrawal of U.S. from the fund, there is a space for any country like Russia if they had to expand.
Faisal, I can't understand.
Yes, I think they have. Okay, I take next question. Ifra, please.
Just write it down. Tell him to write it down quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see the chat now, so just put it in the chat, and then because I couldn't understand. All right, okay. Who's next?
Yes, you said the student wrote in chat. You said that after leaving Afghanistan, America now want to go to the heartland through Ukraine. So why are other NATO countries and Ukraine allowing themselves to be used? Is resistance in the name of border security or also a propaganda of the Russia? Actually, Russia is afraid of losing its access to the heartland due to NATO coming to Ukraine.
So it seems like a fairly simple question, but it's not. Even though we're talking about the concept of the theory of heartland, I don't want you to take it as. I mean, you can explore it, of course you can, but I don't really think that this is the theory that's governing what's happening now. There's elements of it. And it's a really nice sort of large concept by which to look at these problems. But I think there's other theories that would probably work better. But let's just have a look at and say that why are the Europeans being so silly? Well, they're not. I mean, the thing is that the very small countries like Estonia and Lithuania and they've always been frightened of their big neighbours. That's always the way. Every small country is afraid of its big neighbours. That's the paradox of small powers. I mean, they really they're stuck with it. What can they do? And big powers see them as buffer zones. Little separations from other powers. And they can be a real pain, right? They can be a real thorn in your side. A very small country can be very painful for a big country. But once that had happened, once Estonia and Lithuania and everything got out, well, then all the others thought, well, yeah, hey, we can do this too. And if we can get in the EU, we'll all get rich. But the thing that drove, and this is really important here, because the generation of leaders that Europe has now, except for Macron, all Cold War. They were all born in the Cold War. They all grew up during the Cold War, and so they still think in that sort of Cold War mindset, as the Chinese say. But not Macron, actually. Macron's slightly different. But 30 years they've had the deals So it was at Schmidt, I think, that signed the deals. They've had cheap, reliable Russian energy into Germany, which powers Europe, for 30 years. And, you know, the fantastic economic growth that Europe's had over the last 30 years, you know, I mean, everybody loves Mercedes and, you know, all that Volkswagen and all that stuff and all the big car companies and Airbus and you name it, right? Everything that's German, everybody thinks, oh, German quality, it's fabulous. But all of this stuff is powered by Russian, cheap, reliable Russian energy. And at no point in that 30-year relationship did the Russians ever turn around and say, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to do this. That didn't happen. It was a very, very, very good relationship. And the Americans just, you know, saw that as being just terrible. And, of course, the Americans, and that is sort of heartland theory, the idea that the Germans and the Europeans rely on the Russians and the Asia East for their energy, for their markets, and they have, you know, really close interaction. That scares the Americans enormously because that would make them an island, because those economies would be so much bigger than America's economy. And you can see that what America's already hates the Chinese idea of the economy being bigger than theirs. And imagine what they think if you know, Russia and Central Asia and Europe's economies just got so much bigger than the American economy. I mean, that just frightens them to death. And then there's the idea, of course, that, you know, hey, why aren't you buying our energy? You know, we're a competitor in the market. But so there was some tricky stuff going on. For example, Angela Merkel, right? She'd been spied on by the CIA, WikiLeaks, all that. She wanted to maintain that relationship, have a very strong relationship with Russia, with Europe. And, you know, the Russians weren't threatening. So she was fine with that. And, yeah, let's have more gas and energy, no problem. And then we'll also try and get, diversify, no problem. But when she resigned, and they had the election, because she'd been there a long time and she was just very, very tired. Health problems, real health problems. So the opposition parties got in. It's a very weak alliance, only three parties. One of them, the Greens, the foreign minister, very anti-China, very pro-US, anti-Russia, anti-China. And it was a very weak coalition. So what, you know, they just... The German listen, the Americans have been running politicization programs. Huge politicization programs, all these think tanks and all this sort of stuff that are running in Europe, politicizing everybody to the idea that the Americans are the only solution to any problem. And, you know, definitely don't connect to the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else, or the Indians or anybody, or Pakistan. And they've done that. And so they deliberately weakened Angela Merkel's party, and that weak three-party coalition just crashed straight away. I mean, they just folded straight away and said, no Nord Stream 2, and yeah, let's go into the Ukraine, right? Now, in France, the same thing happened. Macron was talking about, Merkel and Macron were talking about European strategic autonomy, and Macron was talking about a European army, and they all buy European weapons, and we all work together, and less NATO. And why did that suddenly change? Well, something very strange happened. The Australians cancelled 2 contracts, one for submarines, and they cancelled one for helicopters. And the Americans tried to cancel the arrangement with the Greeks for ships. And altogether, that all happened just before the elections. So Macron looked really bad when he went into the elections because he had lost all these really big contracts and 10, 20,000 jobs gone, and, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars gone. And so he only just, you know, second round against a right-wing racist, fascist candidate in France, and he only just got through. But in the legislative elections, he lost. So now he's what's called a lame duck. He can't get new legislation through. And what happened? He turned around and went, oh, okay, NATO, okay, fine, yep, I'll back it. So you see that the Americans actually played a very long game here. It's not, you don't imagine that this just sort of happened randomly. This is like ad hoc kind of situation. This has been carefully orchestrated. And the Americans have worked very hard to undermine European unity. And then, if you look at that, you will understand that that's the American modus operandi, is divide and conquer. And they put themselves at the center of Europe. So they are now the central power in Europe. Nothing can be done in the EU without the US agreeing to it. And they're backed by the UK. Remember, when the Americans backed Brexit, and Brexit, of course, weakened Europe. And it's weakened the UK enormously. And so the Americans now have more say in London and more say in Brussels. And they're trying to do the same here in ASEAN. They're trying to be, the Americans are trying to put themselves in the center of ASEAN by trying to split ASEAN against Laos and Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. But the ASEAN, they're not going for that because they've got 5% economic growth. Why the hell would they do it? But you see, Europe's not like that. Europe's got zero, economic growth. The Americans have really orchestrated this. It's a much larger design, and that's where you need to understand that this is a much larger design over decades. This is not some kind of just this year or that year or this week or that week. There is ideological underpinnings and notions about democracy will ultimately be supreme and the whole world will be democratic and it'll be run from Washington. Right? If the whole world was democratic already, then the UN General Assembly wouldn't need a Security Council. They just all vote. Right? So we need to be very careful.
We will take last questions quickly, and Ms. Mariam, please ask your question. Last question.
Hello, my name is Mariam, and I want to ask that, is European crisis a golden opportunity for China to draw away the US attention from Taiwan by moving into a third Cold War with Russia, or after innovating Russia's position in Ukraine, another victory in Taiwan would await the US like the Sandwich Islands?
Well, your question has a presumption in it, and it's problematic. Will China take advantage of the situation, the crisis well, it's advantageous for them for sure. It just makes them more powerful. That's what I've been trying to say to you, is that China is now the moderator, the mediator globally for peace. It's the most powerful manufacturing, most advanced manufacturing industrial base in the world, the largest exporter in the world. It's the largest trading partner of, 150 countries or something, 120 countries. The Belt and Road is connected to 150. Now that's basically 2017 when Xi Jinping went to Davos and made his speech about open trade and so forth. That was it. China was the champion of free trade, right? Globalization and free trade. Now, after what the Americans have done with NATO, China is now the champion of global peace. And of course it's going to work well for them because red line number one is reunification with Taiwan. And the Americans are the ones that are blocking that, making that, impossible for them. Now, there's all sorts of geostrategic security problems in there that, you would need to have a look at. But the fundamental point here is that that's a red line and that there's no way that'll change. And you can see what happens when you go past a red line. The Russians and NATO, Ukraine going into NATO, the Russians told the Americans so many times, hundreds of times, that just don't do this. And that's our red line. And the Americans said, they'll never do it. Well, they did. And now the Americans are paying for it in a big time, and they can't afford it. And now they're losing their mantle as a sort of peacemaker. Now China's going to be the peacemaker. Now, that's a real change of events in the whole world. So I think you need to be, following. You're living in a very exciting time. That's all I can say. But no, I do not believe that China is using this for narrow, selfish national interest. I do not believe that is true. I believe that it's using it in the understanding that all of its partners are going to grow rich, and then China will get richer too. Okay, right? Which is the idea of a free and open trade. That's the whole idea, right? So, and if you just look at what they're actually doing, you can see that that's actually working. In Cambodia, 10 years of trade with China, the economy here has grown 7% per annum for 10 years. That's phenomenal. ASEAN and China have got 5% GDP growth this year, right? The US got 0, 1. Inflation at 5 and GDP growth at 1, that's -4. Okay, it's -4. So what you're really seeing here is the global north, the advanced economies are shrinking. They're all shrinking because wars are expensive and it causes inflation. And, and the 0% interest on money, easy money, is inflationary as well. There's all sorts of complications in that geo-economical puzzle that I don't have time to explain to you. But basically, having wars and starting wars is really, really bad for your economy. So China's not doing it, right?
Okay. I also thank you so much, Professor Dr. Digvijay James M, for sharing their insights with us today and give us a precious time. I hope this discussion has provided valuable perspectives on the heartland theory and Ukraine realities. Remember, geopolitics issues like these are complex and constantly evolving, so it's important to stay informed, engaged. I want to thank my students and faculty for their active participation in today's webinar. Your questions and comments have helped to make this discussion truly engaging and thought-provoking. As we wrap up, I encourage you to continue exploring fascinating topic of heartland theory and its implication for the current situation in Ukraine. I would like to thank to all of you. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Professor, to give your stand. Thank you. Okay, bye, and have a good day.
All your students.
Good luck.
I hope it's helpful.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.